Hi everyone, this is Francesca Maxime and Wise Girl for January 25th. And I just want to say happy late January. It's been warm and chilly, and just kind of speaks to the whole idea that everything is sort of up and down, right? There's always a process that we're in that is both fluid, ever-changing, and also very much alive with us in the present moment. And so in the weather world today in New York, that's a little cooler than it was just a couple days ago. But in the internal weather world, that felt sense that we have when we look into our bodies and tune into what's going on inside of us, I feel like even though it's relatively calm outside, there's a lot of activity going on for me. And I wanted to share with you a little bit about why that is, I believe, ask you whether or not you feel it too, and see if there isn't a way to open up the dialogue on this and create more space around an issue that has certainly been consuming a lot of our national attention, and I think in my case, especially our personal attention over the last few months. And that is, as Oprah talked about a few weeks ago at the Golden Globes, the Me Too, Time's Up, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, pressures and abuses that we've seen, as recently even in quite unflinching detail with USA Gymnastics' Larry Nassar and his 160 victims who all came forward that were abused as children under the guidance and care of this man that they were directed to trust, and that especially as kids they relied on not only for their well-being physically, but their emotional well-being at a certain level, because again, as kids, when you're in this situation of development, those folks that you're told to be in their care, they have a large influence on you in so many ways, including in the ways that he abused those girls. So I applaud them and every woman and boy and man who has suffered at the hands of any abusers, whether they be family, friends, institutional, work, legally violated, meaning that whether the offense was reported or not, was actually brought to the forefront legally and prosecuted or not, whether or not you've been suffering in silence. And I also want to bring attention to the fact that there's a lot of folks that I think have experienced extremely inappropriate, lasting, repercussion-oriented, unwanted advances from others, either as children or as adults, who literally just don't say anything and stuff it because there is essentially possibly too much at stake. So a lot of this has to do with not only what's going on inside with the person who is victimized, but also what's going on with the person who is the abuser. And there's a lot of conversation around backlash and, people who say, well, are you going to lump all men into this category of being rapists? And the answer to that is no. There is a spectrum, just like there's a spectrum of sexuality and sexual orientation and a spectrum of a lot of things like skin tone or, racial makeups. There's spectrums in the rainbow. There's no one thing. We're not in categories here, despite, however, we may want to trick our mind into being more binary. We're just not that way, and the world just isn't that way. There is also a spectrum to offensive behavior as it pertains to sexual abuse and sexual assault. But what I will say is that the media's attention on Me Too and Time's Up is really warranted, because oftentimes what I've found in reading all of these accounts, like the one that I just read by journalists from ProPublica that details covered up abuses at the Red Cross, and other recent accounts by a congressman who had some fantastical notion perhaps about a relationship that was wanted, in his opinion, with one of his young female staffers, and a lot of other instances that have come up. is something that I wanted to share that's more, I think, foundational and fundamental regarding systemic patriarchy, systemic categories, systemic toxic masculinity, and also what's underneath that and what's behind that, and what can we do about it, and how equality is really the answer. It makes men happier and healthier and women happier and healthier. Boys and children, girls and children of all kinds end up benefiting from a perspective of equality and a lived equality in one's experience. But a lot of people don't know what that looks like. And I will say that part of the path of mindfulness and the ancient wisdom teachings that pertain to meditation and sort of guidelines for what one would call, living with integrity and living with virtue really can kind of help guard against some of these abuses and sort of nip them in the bud before they manifest into action. So there's an opportunity for people who are looking inward and turning their eyes inside, not always just outside, but looking inward, which is the work of investigation in mindfulness and insight meditation, that once you do that, it's a lot easier to bring a certain level of awareness, the consciousness that we are, the awareness of what it is that's going on with us in terms of a felt sense with sensation, into our wider view, so that we don't just act out of reactivity and out of this amygdala sort of lower brain structure that's more going for a fight, flight, or freeze kind of response, or our limbic structures, our emotional brain, our midbrain, that's often tied up in, really going for that which is pleasurable without necessarily a heck of a lot of prefrontal cortex engagement, which is where we do rational decision making. So let me back up. Gloria Steinem, when I was interviewing her a couple years ago, said, we're linked, we're not ranked. So that means that we, meaning women and men, are linked and not ranked. And also, I think she would extrapolate to say the same of, animals and the planet, and probably has said as much, but not in that particular interview. And essentially that the more that we're able to see one another as the human beings that we are, prior to only getting enveloped in a person's gender and sexuality and whether or not it's pleasing or displeasing, we can begin to kind of make there be a space for another person's existence that isn't predicated on our pleasure or our aversion. That's what mindfulness is. Present, moment-to-moment awareness, non-judgmental, without clinging, without grasping, without pushing away, or without zoning out about. So, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because as it relates to systemic patriarchy, toxic masculinity, what I think happens a lot of the time is young boys are not given an opportunity to be able to have a full range of human experience. They're socialized at an early age, oftentimes, particularly in Western culture, but I think generally speaking, oftentimes, although not always, but particularly in Western culture, to abdicate feelings, heart space, in order to position themselves as aggressors or winners or dominant in whichever way that isn't necessary, but as defined as a gender, men is sort of saying, well, I can't be woman-like, I can't be girly, I don't want to be called a wuss or other kinds of names. I'm talking about, cisgender, heterosexual norms here. There is, as I said earlier, this larger container of a spectrum, but for the purposes of this conversation, just using this as a general step off of the conversation that we're having, because it seems to pertain most closely to the majority of accounts that we're seeing reported in the press about Me Too and Time's Up. That when we're looking at young boys, they have to get cut off from their full range of human experience in order to survive their socialization. right? In much the same way, women are asked to sacrifice their voices, asked to sacrifice their ability to call out whatever it is that they may be excited about, and taught to become somehow softer and more receptive and less assertive, perhaps, or aggressive. But what I'd like to say is one of the things that mindfulness will bring to you is a re-entry point into allowing yourself to have and hold a full range of human experience. So that means that you're allowed to be angry and you're allowed to be sad. That means that you're allowed to recognize that there are feelings of frustration and irritation that arise, as much as there are feelings of lack of worth, lack of worthiness, undeservingness, that those also arise. And that none of those feelings, whatever they are, and there could be many, many feelings. I'm feeling, there's a feeling of calm that's present. There's a feeling of, joy that's present. There's a feeling of impatience that's present. Whatever those actual feelings are and emotions are, they're actually present in the body before we make up some story about them as to why we may be feeling a certain way. But they often go back to a more limbic memory, our emotional brain, of something that happened to us early in our childhood, quite honestly, out of our environment. And then we end up responding in a sort of habituated way and telling our stories around that. So, for example, this woman is, presenting herself in such a way that reminds me of my mom, and I don't have a good relationship with my mom, so I'm, putting her in a category of aversive. I don't like her. I want to, pop her in that category, so I'm going to stay away from her or be angry at her or something. When in fact, that may be the baggage that I'm bringing to the table, not that she's actually presenting. If I were able to just see her with more clear eyes, notice that I may have that feeling of anger or frustration arise about her, but then go deeper and turn the eyes inside and investigate myself as to, well, where is that all coming from? And get back deeper into that story of, I'm really upset that I didn't get what I needed when I was a kid. Not only am I angry, underneath that layer of anger is a layer of grief that I haven't touched on, is a layer of sadness that I haven't touched on, is a layer of longing for connection that I haven't touched on, is a layer of wanting to be loved, wanting to feel at home, wanting to feel seen and felt and met in a way that I haven't with this situation, and so it provokes that in me, that I'm wanting all of that. That's an example, possibly, of what we look at when we investigate, what we discover, I should say, when we investigate more deeply. And I would suggest that in many cases with men who have been abusive and inappropriate, or both, that they're not doing that kind of work. They are not creating the space in between to pause and think about the impact of what the actions are. Because they are so terrified of looking inside internally for being identified as wusses or as women or not as strong or not as dominant, that their identity is so wrapped up in that this whole idea of going back to what I proposed at the beginning, meeting each other at an equal plane as two individuals. One may be heterosexual male and one may be heterosexual female, but that you're meeting the other person as a human being. You have the capacity to experience a full range of your emotions without acting on them and being reactive. And you allow that for the other person. You see them as who they really are, not in terms of what they can do for you, even if they have no desire to do anything with or for you, right? As we've seen time and time again. We call this, in these ancient wisdom teachings, wrong view, delusion, not really having a clarity internally of what it is that's going on, and how wrong view is the basis of suffering. Wrong view is the basis of what it is that creates suffering inside for the person who's the perpetrator, but also for the people who end up being the unwitting recipients of whatever the abuse is. Inappropriate boundaries, actual sexual assault, the gray area, for lack of a better word, that is the range in between, much of which is illegal, some of it which may not be, but is still inappropriate. We need to go back to a yes is yes, use our words, be adults. And this is about adults with agency, communicating with adults with agency. There's a lot of people in adult bodies that are technically older, whether you're in your 20s or 30s or 40s or up, that are still letting the 5 or 10-year-old inside drive the bus of their lives. And consequently, when that little kid's feet can't touch the pedal, the bus crashes into a ravine. And whether or not the driver survives, i.e. the perpetrator, oftentimes there's casualties in the back. And oftentimes there's whiplash from people that they don't report to insurance, that they don't go forward with, but that they're still suffering the repercussions of many, many years later. Suffering in silence, not able to live a full range of experience. Their life has been limited because of this other person's inability to say, I'm going to put the adult version of me in the driver's seat here. I'm not going to let that 5-year-old needy child of me take the wheel and then end up crashing the bus. And then, yeah, if I walk away unscathed, great. If I don't and I get crucified, well, that's, something that I'll deal with at that time. But it's getting to know who you really are so that you can then decide, wow, okay, wait a minute, I've been letting this 5-year-old drive the bus of my life. And it's creating all these accidents. And it's creating problems for me and for other people. And this has got to stop. I will say that people have a true nature of consciousness that is spacious and allowing, and everything exists in that, including the shadow side, which is much more this contracted and fearful place that we can notice in our own bodies that oftentimes is not that insight, spacious awareness that enables us to make more agency-oriented decisions that are non-harming and instead nourishing and compassionate toward other people. But when we get stuck and locked in that place because we needed to learn certain survival instincts when we were a kid, oftentimes we end up using those later on in life, and it's not helpful, and it creates problems. I'll say that, as I did in a recent article that I published on Medium about sexual assault and childhood developmental trauma and family sexual abuse, that inappropriate boundaries as a child can really be extremely damaging. I know I experienced that with my father when I was a child. I know that that had lasting impact as I became a young adult, a young woman, and even, I won't say a full-fledged adult, but, somebody who's now well into midlife. And understanding not only why it came to be that my father was the kind of a person that he was, because I've looked at this and I think that he experienced deep abandonment issues when my grandmother had to leave Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and my father was there as a child with his other siblings, fending for himself with his dad. And my grandmother had gone to Chicago to earn money to send for her kids, but they were separate for a while. And mind you, the only reason why she left them in the first place was because her husband, my grandfather, my father's father, was philandering. That perhaps left an indelible wound on my dad, and he was never satisfied. He always wanted more. He wasn't concerned about the needs of other people. And I see a lot of that with men happening now with this Me Too and Time's Up movement. I remember in college, I went to an Ivy League school. There was a woman who I was friendly with who reported that she was assaulted. I remember that the boys were given either a semester or a year off, but allowed to graduate. They were not prosecuted in any way outside of school. I remember my first job after college. The interviewer interviewed me in a hotel room on a bed, which I reported and I felt was inappropriate. And then months later, one of my supervisors at a trade show, I mean, if you can picture this, it was at the New England Aquarium. We were in the middle of literally a shark tank, stuck his tongue down my throat, which I also reported. That was not pleasant or welcome at an event that we were having there, professional event. I know that one of my friends was working for a big PR mogul and also experienced this person sticking his tongue down her throat when she was working for him and had to leave that job. I know that when I was a reporter, the Catholic priest sex abuse scandal was happening, and I was doing live shots in front of Paul Shanley's rectory and being told that, Bernard Law didn't have anything to do with this. The cardinal who was found to be responsible for shifting priests around parish to parish after they had been abusive of kids. I interviewed a lot of SNAP victims, people who are childhood survivors of sexual abuse. And seeing what just happened in the news due to the ProPublico report from the Red Cross's shuffling of the person who worked there, who allegedly was involved in raping a woman who worked there and was then allowed to go get another job at another nonprofit, another charity, that this is typical behavior, right? These things are systemically allowed. They're protocols that are followed. But with this Me Too backlash, there's a lot of conversation about what constitutes actual sexual assault and doesn't, right? Those are instances where it's workplace sexual harassment. Well, what if you don't work for the person? I've had several instances where I've not actually worked for someone, but I might have worked for them, possibly at some point going forward, and they have been inappropriate, and that has negated the possibility of working together. For example, I remember there was a TV network here in the city, New York City, where I had met the executive at a fundraiser for a nonprofit and talked to him about the work that I was doing in international news, exchanged business cards, followed up that week. His invitation was to his home, not to his office, to a bar, not to his office, during the evening, not during the day. I had all the right credentials to work at that network. I didn't go to those places. I never engaged with that person afterwards, and it never got off the ground. But there was a clear invitation on the table to meet with him privately that was not allowed to happen in his office, right? That's not what he wanted. So what does that say? That says that the person wants to be privately romantic with you, or doesn't want to be supervised, or doesn't want to have anyone else around. That happened again with someone I met at a journalism conference who was a host for a show on a major broadcast network, who was someone that I shared a lot in common with, and both professionally and personally, and also just sort of interest-wise. Someone that I knew was married, someone that I knew had kids, and agreed to meet with this person at a time that at that time was mutually convenient, which happened to be a dinner time in a restaurant near where we both lived. We live in relatively the same part of New York City. After which time, that person proceeded to stick their tongue down my throat, which was not the welcome move, and also explain some theory about having an open marriage and how, this could be some kind of a relationship of some kind to benefit what? His desires. So again, why was I looking at even talking to this person? Well, because they're professional colleagues. It happens with other women all the time that I will have informational interviews or meetings with, many of whom I've become friends with, but never does it escalate to something like this that then causes me to truncate the relationship and not pursue conversations not only about potentially working at the network or getting any information there, but also, that there's clearly no friendship there because the boundaries have been violated. Because, again, this person was not able to see me, in this case, as a full, equal human being, could only see me as a hypersexualized version of what they wanted, whatever that is, as opposed to what might be good for me, or what might be skillful, or what might be non-harming. And again, that goes back to this whole idea of toxic patriarchy and, entitlement, and a lot of people will talk about privilege or white privilege. Yes, these are the issues that we investigate when we're in insight meditation. We go back and we turn our eyes inside. We look at ourselves and say, well, what's really motivating me? Why do I think it's okay? Why do I need to be so greedy? I already have a wife and kids. Why can't I focus on that? I'll also say this happened again recently with another media executive who I knew was married and had kids, and I was, again, thinking that this person was someone who was able to recognize me as a full human being, but I was sorely disappointed because, again, that person proceeded with the same exact behavior that this other person did, minus the narrative about, we can have a relationship even though I'm married and all of that. Right? So, this idea of greed, taking what's not freely given, is directly related to these wisdom teachings of non-harming, non-stealing, non-sexual misconduct, non-intoxication, right view, seeing clearly, right speech, not lying. And these systemic structures that we have been a part of, it's the water that all the fish of all of us humans and animals, for that matter, are swimming in. These structures in Western culture don't work anymore. They're not beneficial to all. They had some benefit for some and do still benefit some, but that gap is getting wider and wider and deeper, as we've seen. Through recent reports, 1% holds 50% of the wealth. That's kind of crazy. So what are we going for here? Where are we going to move forward when it comes to our ability to prevent these kind of abuses from happening? Because they happen in families, in homes, with family sexual abuse, with incest, between siblings, between uncles, grandparents, fathers, mothers, whomever. They happen in the workplace, where it's defined as workplace sexual harassment and it's illegal. They happen in nonprofits. They happen in back alleys. They happen in marriages where, if I'm not mistaken, although it's been retracted, Ivanka Trump allegedly had said at once that she was raped within her marriage. These things happen. But where do we want to go as a society, as a culture, as a people? And what's the medicine for what we need to move forward in a way that is kinder, more loving, more gentle to ourselves and others? If we're stuck on the treadmill of consumerism, of capitalism, of production, of scale. We are going to be caught up in fear of death, fear of contraction, fear that leads to contraction, fear of not getting mine, not getting my piece of the pie, and that constant pressure that we have of if we're not subjugating, if we're not doing this, if we're not pushing down on, if we're not being greedy and pulling out of, whether it's the planet, it's natural resources, whether it's a woman's body, I want this from you. If we're not doing that, then one has to come to an investigation that includes, who am I? Who and what am I minus this impulse of not wanting to be a wuss, not wanting to be girly, and not extracting my value from the kudos that I get from pushing down others or taking from others. Not getting my value from that either, which is currently how our society is sort of structured. We're rewarded for that extraction, for that management, that control. So who would you really be if you didn't operate that way? If you knew that there was another way that was linked and not ranked, who would you be? And how do we begin to do the work of investigating our own true nature, our own selves, and recognize that who we really are, this consciousness that's spacious and luminous and beautiful, and does have space for both the light and the dark, that is the witness of all of it, and we're not apart from it. And we also have our own personal subjective realities of conditioning, nurture, and nature, our epigenetics, and our habit patterns formed with survival patterns that we've had growing up that we may or may not have still operate in our adult lives. That our backstory, that our true nature is different from our backstory, right? That if we aren't so afraid of what this is, if we start digging into it, but can rest in some of what this is, that maybe that can give us the courage to start opening this up and looking at it in a way that has kindness, non-judgmental acceptance, and allows us to have what was denied to us oftentimes, which is a full experience of our own humanity that includes loss and grief and irritation and sadness and joy and anger and calm and frustration and beauty and love and compassion and the whole range of experience. That we're not pushing away these feelings that we had as a kid that are still in us, that make us feel contracted or make us feel greedy, make us feel powerful when we're lording over, right? We are mammals, we're interdependent, and we live in a society that wants to talk about rugged individualism and independence and the fact that we can do it all on our own. But there is a certain depraved nature to that way of thinking, the idea of being deprived of that full range of allowing and being kind to oneself, being compassionate towards one's experience, and then using that compassion as the gasoline in the tank for investigating what that experience is about, knowing that your full background of true nature, your full background of consciousness, from which all of this stuff comes and is a part, that stuff is workable because you're larger than that, you're bigger than that. And this holds for abusers and survivors. This holds for people who are locked into conditioned habits and patterns that are harming others, including themselves, as well as people who are fighting to restore a sense of dignity and nobility that's never been left, never gone, but has been obscured by abusive experiences where others have not held the person, the victim, in high regard, with care, meeting the other person as a full human being and not just as an object of desire. So I guess I'll just close by saying this is a cycle that needs to be stopped and can be stopped. And I don't think it's, although this incredible reporting that my fellow journalists are doing is absolutely requisite and amazing, and we need to support local journalism, investigative journalism, and frankly, independent journalism. Because oftentimes corporate parents have certain areas that they are more or less willing to go into because it will serve their shareholders' interests or not. That as the fourth estate, the journalist's role is to question what's going on and look into what is, and if something's off, to dig a little deeper and to report it. And that's what we're getting at now. That's the work that we've been seeing. And a lot of people, even if they can do that about abuse cases or about Wall Street misdeeds, the Bernie Madoffs of the world, whatever it is, they have a hard time doing it to themselves and for themselves. But it's necessary. Across the board, this ability to figure out why whatever is happening. Keep asking that question. Who am I really? Who am I really? This deeper, greater consciousness, this mind like sky, where the bird moves through it, is a part of the whole kit and caboodle. The cloud is there, the thunder showers are there, but no one piece of it is identifiable as a fixed me or mine. All sky, just like the ocean is not separate from the wave. So we're a part of this whole catastrophe, as Zorba the Greek would say, right? But that consciousness is our greater awareness, our greater experience, but that there is also the part that we need to work with, turning the eyes inside, doing the investigation, not just on these kinds of reportorial stories, which very much require and need our attention, but also for ourselves. And yes, I'm speaking to men, but I'm also speaking to women. Anyone who has felt as though they've been fearful or contracted and have acted in such a way that has been harming of other people because one doesn't know why one is feeling so uncomfortable in the first place, and then hasn't built skills to know that, one, that's not really who you are, and two, that yes, you can work with this conditioning through investigation of how you got there, so then you can create space around it so you don't repeat negative, harming behavior going forward. And that is to chip away at systemic patriarchy, to chip away at the conditioning of the greed that we can see in Western culture, Western society, the comfort culture, and in unbridled, always to scale, going for maximum profitability type of capitalism. We need to look at the intersectionality of all of this. So I'll close by saying that the real goal is to be able to accept ourselves fully as human beings, entirely with our own innate deep perfection, but also with our habituated conditioning that can be maladaptive but understandable, and investigate this with this presence so that we can then learn how to operate from a place of love and compassion, non-judgmentally, with more equanimity, with more balance, with more love toward ourselves and toward others. Because we don't need to keep perpetuating this. We're much stronger when we work together. We are mammals. We are independent, interdependent. We're not just independent creatures. And, the truth shall set you free. Whatever that is, your truth. You investigate it. Your truth for you. You don't have to lock it away in a closet and throw away the key. Investigate that truth. Find out what your motivations are for stuff, even if they're, deep in the unconscious, you can look at that. You can go to a therapist. You can go to a meditation teacher, meditation center. You can call me. I have my listing on my somatic experiencing website. You can start looking at these things without so much fear and start questioning, what do we think of as our identity? Can we put that down for a minute and get more curious about what are we really wanting and needing in our hearts? And attend to that. That's our job. Attend to that, not with other people by, trying to extract from them something that we want of them, but trying to do for ourselves, the reparenting, if you will, that maybe we didn't receive, and mourning and grieving that. Really. And it may take some time, but that's okay. This is not a 3-second attention span exercise. This is a life practice. So that we can feel okay in our own bodies, so that when our death is knocking on our door, we can release and let it go without having a conscience that is fearful and contracted because we haven't worked out some of this stuff. That we can live more fully with more joy, more wisdom, more thriving in our daily life now, because we're not trying to hide from ourselves. We're not trying to hide from other people. So that's all I'm going to say for now. Today was a long one, but I don't know. I've been thinking a lot about this stuff. So feel free to leave me a message, shoot me an email, and mainly, take care. Take time to refocus and recenter and reach out to people if you're feeling alone. There's lots of good groups out there. RAIN for women who are survivors, RAINN. There's lots of men's organizations as well that can help address this. I know there's a male therapist that I've found to be helpful named Terry Real out of Boston, who's actually going to be speaking at the Goop conference this weekend that Gwyneth Paltrow holds. And he wrote a good article about toxic masculinity and patriarchy this fall that you can Google. His name is Terry Real, just like REAL, like it's real or it's fake. And I don't know, just be kind. See if we can just work on that for now and breathe. Take it easy. Have a good day.